HighBridge, a division of recorded books, presents Out of One, Many, Ancient Greek Ways of Thought and Culture by Jennifer T. Roberts, read by Petrea Burchard. Thus, at one time, they all learned how to grow into one out of many, and then, as they all split apart, they again became many from one. Empedocles, B. 17. Prologue. They contain multitudes. The ancient Greeks are still very much with us. The modern city of Athens boasts streets named for the lawgiver Solon, the admiral Themistocles, the god Hermes. The main shopping street in Rhodes is Socrates Street, and a labyrinth of lanes off the southern part of the street leads to Pythagoras Street. Every year on the first Monday of Lent, the people of Tyrnavos in northern Greece honor the god Dionysus by parading through the streets bearing phalluses they have made of clay, wood, and bread, and inviting passers-by to kiss their creations. Although the Greek that is spoken today throughout the Greek mainland and islands differs markedly from ancient Greek, just try to order a meal in the language of Plato. In the 9 small towns that make up Graecia Salentina in South Italy, a tongue far closer to the language of the ancients is often heard, the dialect known as Greco. It is the last linguistic survival of the culture of Magna Graecia, Greater Greece, as Sicily and southern Italy were known in antiquity. We need not be in Europe to feel the Greek presence. Freudian psychoanalysis makes much of the story of Oedipus, and cognitive behavioral therapy is grounded in the teachings of Zeno and the Stoics. Writers in cultures as different as those of France and Nigeria, South Korea and Colombia, Egypt and the United States have found in the story of Oedipus a useful platform for addressing the concerns of their own societies. In New York City, where I live, the Greek heritage is kept alive by the philanthropy of Aristotle Onassis, named for the famous philosopher, and of John D. Rockefeller, Jr., who provided inspiration and the funding for the remarkable works of art at Rockefeller Center in Midtown Manhattan, including the outsized bronze statues of Atlas and Prometheus. Here in the United States, there are more than 20 cities named Athens, and nearly that many Spartas. 16 states can boast Homers. Achilles streets can be found in California, in Nebraska, and in New Jersey. Only Nashville, Tennessee, however, can boast its own Parthenon, complete with a statue of Athena by sculptor Alan Lequire, that at nearly 40 feet is one of the largest indoor sculptures in the world. But the ancient Greeks were not a monolithic bunch. Achilles did not look at the world at all in the same way as Socrates, who in turn differed from Aristotle, who differed from the Stoics. Like most people, ancient Greeks were a bundle of contradictions. Given to waxing lyrical about the joys of freedom, they also kept huge numbers of hapless slaves in subjection. Home to an extraordinary proliferation of different schools of thought about both gods and mortals, Greece was also a place where people could be put to death for things they thought or said about religion, even in Athens, where freedom of expression was one of the watchwords of the democracy. Greeks were both contradictory and complex. We know much more about some than about others. Of the thought patterns of the poor, the female, the enslaved, we have little evidence. We know a good deal about how free Greek men thought about these muted groups, but little about what people who belonged to these groups believed about anything. Although the Athenian Aristophanes wrote 3 comedies about women that tell us a great deal about how men imagined women's thought patterns, they reveal little about the thinking of actual women. We would know much more if we knew which sex had invented which myths. Surely a number of the Greek myths that have come down to us had been formulated by women, who then, as now, engaged in storytelling with their children. Even the urban, elite males to whom we owe the bulk of the surviving literature, however, revealed a wide variety of outlooks, and though not many women left a record of their thoughts, some did. The Spartan Tyrtaeus, a poet of uncertain date, identified martial courage as the only valid measure of a man. "I would not take account of anyone," he wrote, "just because he is athletic, or rich, or powerful, or handsome, or indeed had every one of these qualities but lacked a fighting spirit. But in warfare," he contended, lies excellence, the very finest thing in all the world, surely the fairest prize a youth can seek to win, a noble boon his city and its people share with him, when someone stands among the foremost spears, planting his feet with no thought of foul flight, his soul and steadfast heart superbly trained, encouraging the man who stands nearby. And he who, fighting in the foremost ranks, loses his dear life, showers on his city and all his countrymen, and on his father, the greatest glory, bearing many wounds in front, through breastplate and through sturdy shield. Those sturdy shields protected not only the wearer, but also the man next to him, and it was impressed on Greek soldiers that nothing could be more shameful than throwing away one's shield and running. The outspoken 7th-century mercenary Archilochus, from the Aegean island of Paros, cannot have been alone in questioning this ideology in eminently unheroic verse. No doubt some Thracian guy has got my shield. More power to him. It's in perfect shape, but I was forced to leave the thing behind under a bush. Me, though, I got away. The hell with that old shield, since I can buy another one that's every bit as good. Not surprisingly, the 5th-century poet Pindar from Thebes, north of Athens, who received substantial commissions for composing odes in honor of athletic victories, defines excellence in terms of physical prowess, writing in connection with the Pythian Games in honor of Apollo, so named because of Apollo's reported slaying of the serpent-slash-dragon Pytho. Only a god's heart is untouched by pain, but fortunate and worthy of acclaim by all the wisest poets is the man who wins a victory by means of excellence of hands or speedy feet, the man who gains the greatest prizes from his daring strength, and in his lifetime sees his stripling son duly rewarded with a Pythian crown. Though he can never reach the brazen sky of all the glories mortals can attain, his voyage takes him to the farthest shore. The philosopher Xenophanes from Colophon in Anatolia had a different perspective. If a man should win in some event at Olympia, he says, his fellow townsmen would make a colossal fuss over him, but he would not deserve it as Xenophanes does. For better than the strength of man or horse is wisdom of the kind I call my own. People, though, don't think clearly about this. It is not right to value simple strength above the sacred wisdom of the mind. For if among the populace there's one who's good at boxing or at wrestling, who wins the arduous pankration, or the pentathlon, or a runner, say, since racing skill of all the tests of strength receives the greatest honor at the games, this would not make his city better run. The most famous female poet of antiquity attested to the outsized role war played in the Greeks' frame of reference when she wrote, "Some say of all the sights one could behold, the loveliest is cavalry. Some say, no, infantry. Still others say a fleet. I see things differently. I say that she whom one loves best is the most beautiful." Sappho goes on to express her sorrow at the departure of her beloved Anactoria, whose radiant face she would rather see than all the armed forces of wealthy Lydia. Some Greeks hated democracy, while others praised it. Everywhere on earth, claimed an anonymous enemy of popular government, the best element is opposed to democracy, for among the best people there is the least licentiousness and wrongdoing, but rather the most scrupulous concern for what is admirable, whereas among the people there is the greatest disorder and wickedness, because poverty drives them to shameful deeds, and the lack of money can result in ignorance and lack of education. While acknowledging the prevalence of hostility to democracy, the Sicilian politician Athenagoras took a different position. Someone, he concedes, will say that democracy is neither intelligent nor fair, and that it is rather the rich who are best fitted to govern. I say, however, that the people is the name of the whole state, the elite only one segment of it. In addition, the rich are the best at administering the treasury, the wise the best at framing issues, but the people are the best at listening to arguments and judging among them, and that all these functions have their place in a democracy. But what actually happens in an oligarchy is that the few give the many their share of risks and then, not content with the lion's share of the profits, take them all. Plainly, there was no such thing as the Greek value system. Most Greeks believed in the Olympian gods, but a few expressed skepticism. There was no consensus about what people could expect after they died. The Greeks have often been perceived as warlike by temperament, but the war between Athens and Sparta that ravaged Greece from 431 to 404 owed its length in part to powerful ambivalences on both sides, and even after their declaration of war, the Spartans sent to the oracle of Apollo at Delphi to inquire whether they should really go ahead with it. Every opportunity for peace throughout the years of fighting was greeted with heated disagreement on both sides, and of course opinions sometimes changed over the course of a lifetime. In the quarter century that separated Oedipus the king, Oedipus Rex, from Oedipus at Colonus, the playwright Sophocles came to think differently about questions of fate, gods, and human agency. The same philosopher who, in his Republic, scandalized public opinion by suggesting that women could govern as well as men, dotted his other works with strikingly misogynistic remarks, regularly classing women with children and contending that wicked and cowardly men would be reincarnated as women. Some values and beliefs, however, were widely shared. Inscribed on the temple of Apollo at Delphi were the words Maiden Agan, nothing in excess, along with the equally sage caution Gnothi Sauton, know yourself. That is, recognize that you are a mortal with mortal limitation and not a god, and with this few would have disagreed. It is the aim of this book to explore areas of dramatic divergence, areas of subtle difference, and areas of broad agreement. In so doing, we will explore diverse areas of Greek thought and action, politics, religion, performance, competition, literature, and myth. Because myth affected every area of Greek life, we will begin there, bringing onto the stage the rollicking adventures of lovers and warriors, murderers and monsters, and indomitable forces of nature, always asking ourselves, what on earth are we to make of these extraordinary tales that have continued to capture the human imagination over 2,000 years into the future? Chapter 1. A World of the Imagination. We are meaning-seeking creatures. Dogs, as far as we know, do not agonize about the canine condition, worry about the plight of dogs in other parts of the world, or try to see their lives from a different perspective. But human beings fall easily into despair, and from the very beginning we invented stories that enabled us to place our lives in a larger setting, that revealed an underlying pattern, and gave us a sense that, against all the depressing and chaotic evidence to the contrary, life had meaning and value. Karen Armstrong, A Short History of Myth. But a myth, to speak plainly, to me is like a menu in a fancy French restaurant. Glamorous, complicated camouflage for a fact you wouldn't otherwise swallow, like maybe lima beans. William Peter Blatty, The Exorcist. Every Greek lived in at least two worlds. On the one hand, there was the mundane world of the everyday. For women, childbearing and homemaking. For men, farming, sometimes commerce. For citizens, soldiering and politicking. For slaves, backbreaking work of all kinds. On the other, there was the extraordinarily imaginative world of myth, vibrantly alive in literature, art, religion, and in simply every Greek mind. Some fiercely, others with a bemused sense of irony, the Greeks believed in a glorious past that was in every sense fabulous. Few Greeks had much sense of a historical past. What we would call social studies was not part of the school curriculum, and in any case, written records with which the past might be reconstructed were scarce. But to grow up in ancient Greece was to be exposed to a pool of amazing tales about a very different universe, a remote past in which gods and mortals mingled comfortably, indeed interbred, a realm in which earth, having mated with sky, produced one-eyed giants and creatures who might sport 50 heads and 100 arms, where the king of the gods seduced the queen of Sparta in the guise of a swan, where a man accidentally married his mother, where people were transformed into birds and bears and stars and trees, where a goddess killed a giant by picking up Sicily and throwing it at him, and a god was so afraid of being overthrown by one of his children that he swallowed each of his offspring at birth. Love affairs, both heterosexual and homosexual, jealousy, dismemberment, herbs that restore people to life, prophecies and vain attempts to escape them, fiery battles, thrilling chase sequences. It was all there. These tales had in turn been invented at some point in the past by other Greeks who had also farmed and reproduced and kept house and fought and traded, mostly by men, to judge from their largely sexist and patriarchal cast, but some surely by women. The story of how the unsuspecting Persephone was kidnapped by her uncle, the king of the underworld, as a child, but was eventually enabled to spend a good chunk of her time at home with her mother, smacks of invention by some female longing for the secure days before she was snatched from the care of her female relatives and compelled to marry an older man she barely knew. Some were invented from whole cloth, some derived from observations of the natural world, some inspired by riveting tales from the Near East. Like all myths, those of the Greeks fall into certain readily identifiable categories with considerable interconnection and overlap. There are myths of origin designed to explain and justify the existence of the basic building blocks of civilization, which for the Greeks included such phenomena as patriarchy, marriage, law, and animal sacrifice. These stories sometimes overlap with myths about relations between gods and humans. There are myths of conflict between parents and children, particularly fathers and sons. Some of these intersect with myths of origin, as when the reign of Zeus on Olympus is traced first to his overthrow of his father Kronos, and ultimately to Kronos' overthrow, and castration of his own parent Uranos. Some myths explain how the universe came to be, while others set up rules for how humans are to define their place in it. The same can be said of philosophy. There are myths of progress and myths of decline. A number of myths offer variations on the theme of the hero's quest, while others showcase the rite of passage from one stage of life to another, from virgin to wife, or from adolescent boy to responsible adult member of the community. The latter often intersects with myths of subduing monsters of one kind or another, which in turn intersect with myths of the establishment of order out of disorder. The Greeks were born storytellers, and what is a myth if not a story? A story, moreover, is a way of organizing information and of explaining the mysteries of life. What science and philosophy would later approach in theory and abstraction, myth approached in concrete stories, told around a campfire, recited beside an altar, related to children by their elders, chiseled in stone or painted on a vase. The stories we call myths made themselves felt in every aspect of culture in the Greek world, where art and literature were unimaginable without them. But what exactly is a myth, and why does myth come into being in all cultures? What need does it fill? We might say that myths are narratives that have special meaning for a culture, set in a distant past when the universe with which people later became familiar had not yet taken shape. Narratives that unveil a sacred world. All Greek myths, for example, posit a world of kings and queens, princes and princesses, rather than of oligarchies and democracies. Before that, a world with no people at all, only gods. And before that, a world without either gods or people. The principal characters must include some supra-human beings, gods, demigods, heroes with extraordinary powers no longer accorded to mortals. Greek heroes are not necessarily altruistic or kind like modern heroes, who put others before themselves. They can be very self-centered, like Achilles. Living in a mythical time, heroes do not have paying jobs. Monster slaying is not so much a job as an avocation. Sorry, Heracles. Heroes do not run for office. They do not read or write or trade. They do not come down with colds or develop acne. They may, like Zeus, pile one wife on another, but they never divorce. Myth lies somewhere on the spectrum between history and fiction. It is closer to history in that at least at some time it was believed actually to have happened. Closer to fiction in that the events it describes are more exciting and unusual than those of everyday life. Aristotle maintained that poetry, the only kind of fiction he knew, was superior to history because history dealt with a small range of particulars and poetry with a wide range of possibilities. Myth, however, goes poetry one better, for it also deals with impossibilities alternately horrifying and delightful. A priceless guide to the ideology and organization of a civilization, myth remains of uncertain origin, and we must ask, with K.K. Ruthven, whether it is an expression of our freedom to invent alternative realities or merely an agent of those powerful forces, personal and traumatic, or racial and primordial, which determine our lives. In the 19th century, the Scottish scholar William Robertson Smith maintained that myths were developed to explain rituals, whereas the British classicist and polyglot Jane Ellen Harrison maintained that while myth was closely bound up with ritual, it was not designed to explain it. Rather, it functioned as the narrative correlative of ritual. For anthropologist Bronislaw Malinowski, myth served as a pragmatic charter of wisdom, faith, and values designed to undergird the basic structure and ethos of a society. Structuralist Claude Levi-Strauss saw myth as encapsulating fundamental binary oppositions. Myths, he argued, work to organize perceptions of the world by setting up oppositions like chaos and order, sky and underworld, male and female, old and new. Sigmund Freud viewed myths, much like dreams, as a reflection of a particular society's anxieties and desires, a construction that allotted a substantial role in the formation of myth to the unconscious. Though each civilization's myths are distinctive, however, underlying patterns certainly appear. What psychoanalyst Carl Jung, who saw myth as the product of a collective unconscious, called archetypes. Even different practitioners of the same approach can differ widely among themselves in interpreting myths. In his study of myth and psychoanalysis, Robert Eisner has identified several contrasting psychoanalytic approaches to the myth of Oedipus, treated most famously by Sophocles in his tragedy Oedipus the King. The story is well known. Having heard a prophecy that their son would grow up to kill his father and marry his mother, King Laius of Thebes and his wife Jocasta give the baby to a shepherd with instructions to abandon him to his fate, with his ankles pierced and tied to prevent his crawling to safety, a development that seems to explain his name Oedipus, swollen foot, although it's certainly suggestive that the Greek verb for knowing was oida, and knowledge plays a large role in his story. The shepherd, however, takes pity on the infant, who is instead adopted by the king and queen of Corinth. Returning as an adult to Thebes and having no idea of his true identity, he kills Laius in a fight along the road and marries his widow, thus fulfilling the prophecy. For one psychoanalyst, the myth is plainly the story of a deprived child. No, says another, rather it is the case history of a child who has been adopted. A third analyst has a different interpretation. Oedipus has an inferiority complex because of his handicap, the lameness that ensued from having his ankles pierced. Another sees him as a battered child. For heaven's sake, his parents tried to kill him. Still another focuses on his relationship with his mother/wife and sees Oedipus in patients who have been seduced as children by psychotic parents. No single scaffold can hope to accommodate the rich fabric of Greek myth. Certainly, myth serves to connect people with an imagined past and with another transcendent dimension of reality. Shared belief enhances community cohesion. It was probably their myths above all that united the far-flung Greeks into a cohesive culture, for myths provided a huge body of shared cultural reference. Some myths are plainly etiological, from Greek aition, cause, articulating the rationale behind the organization of society or accounting for natural phenomena. The story of the subordination to Zeus of Hera, previously a powerful goddess in her own right, normalized patriarchy. Hera's perpetual ill temper is normally ascribed to her husband's compulsive philandering, but resentment over her demotion might have played a part as well. Some explain natural phenomena. The snatching of Persephone, daughter of the agriculture goddess Demeter by Hades, god of the underworld, accounted for the existence of seasons. When Persephone was with her husband in the underworld, Demeter was so disconsolate that nothing could grow. But when she began to divide her time between her husband and her mother, the land was barren when she was in the underworld, but fruitful when she was on earth. Why are crows black? At one time, all crows were white. But when the crow Apollo had sent to keep an eye on his beloved Coronis informed the jealous god that Coronis was having sex with the mortal Ischys, the enraged Apollo, conflating the message with the messenger, turned it black. Some myths seem to be etymological. When an irate Zeus decided to destroy the human race by flooding the earth, the oracle of the goddess Themis instructed the survivors Deucalion and his wife Pyrrha to repopulate the world by throwing the bones of their mother over their shoulders, whereupon they picked up stones, laos, from Mother Earth and tossed them backward. The Greek word for people was laos, though the derivation is fanciful. The island Anafe, Revelation, owed its name to the rescue of Jason and Medea by Apollo as they were returning to Greece with the Golden Fleece. When they found themselves imperiled by a violent storm at sea, Apollo shot an arrow into the water, causing a flash of lightning that illuminated an island, offering safe anchorage. And this island they named Anafe, because it had been revealed to them by Apollo. Indubitably, some myths do explain a ritual, or at least were believed to do so. Several of these are scattered through the 1st or 2nd century CE compendium, the Library of Greek Mythology, sometimes thought to be written by a man known as Apollodorus, although that was probably not the author's real name. Apollodorus tells how when Jason and Medea erected an altar to Apollo on Anafe and sacrificed there, 12 of Medea's slave girls lobbed indecent jokes at the Argonauts. This, Apollodorus says, is why women make jokes during sacrifices to Apollo on Anafe. When Minos received word of his son's death while he was in the middle of sacrificing to the Graces on the island of Paros, Apollodorus writes, he completed the sacrifice, but cast the ritual garland from his head, and demanded that the customary flutes be silent. And that, Apollodorus explains, is why people sacrifice to the Graces on Paros without flutes or garlands. The women's festival of the Thesmophoria was grounded in several myths, some of which were surely invented to explain the proceedings there. Demeter, so the story went, was so disconsolate after Persephone's disappearance that upon her arrival in Eleusis, she at first declined the couch offered to her by the queen Metaneira, and only agreed when the queen's slave, Iambe, offered her a fleece-covered stool. The goddess sat a long time on the stool, silent and sorrowing, and by no word or sign would she greet anyone at all. She sat, unsmiling, would not eat or drink, pining and longing for her deep-girt child, until astute Iambe intervened with jests and quips. Then did the goddess smile, the holy lady. Then, with joyful heart, Demeter laughed, and ever afterward, Iambe never failed to cheer her moods. It was this playfulness that was put forward to explain the cutting jests exchanged by women at the Thesmophoria, and a parallel tale about the elderly Baubo accounted for the evident vulgarity of the women's remarks. Injured by Demeter's rejection of the food and drink she had offered, Baubo evidently lifted her dress and exposed herself to the goddess, which delighted Demeter so greatly that she happily received the proffered sustenance. Iambe's name, meanwhile, became enshrined in the name iambics, given to a genre of Greek poetry that involved invective, usually, though not always, in an iambic meter, aimed sometimes at society as a whole, sometimes at individuals, and very frequently at women. Archilochus, Simonides, and Hipponax were the most famous of the iambic poets. Archilochus was said to have lambasted the family of a young woman whose father had broken their engagement in such savage lines that they hanged themselves. Simonides composed a satire on women, discussed later in Chapter 5, in iambics. The searing iambics of Hipponax were said to have had a similar impact on the sculptors Bupalus and Aphenis, whose comical likenesses of him had provoked his wrath. From being embedded in a happy story of female bonding, the word came to be associated with punitive verbal assaults. Still other phenomena were reflective of the particularly dramatic aspects of real life, like kidnappings and rapes.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?